Welcome to the Grounded in Peace podcast, where we explore what it means to cultivate peace within ourselves while working toward a more just and harmonious world. Join us as we uncover stories, practices, and ideas that inspire grounded collaborative action for lasting change.
Welcome to the Grounded in Peace podcast. This is Craig Hovey. I am joined today by Derek Kubilus, who is a local Methodist minister. He serves at First United Methodist Church and is the author of Holy Hell, A Case Against Eternal Damnation. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're going to be talking about Christian anarchism. Derek is someone who has a lot of interests, and this is one of his, I was going to say academic interests, but not, I assume not just academic, but I mean...
Life
interests.
Discipleship interests.
Sure. So welcome, Derek.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about, tell us about your interest in Christian anarchism, first of all, and then maybe we can get some kind of definition from you.
Well, they kind of bleed into one another because I think I started using that term and sort of applying it to myself after I became very committed to nonviolence, and I became a Christian pacifist. And for me, the two are inextricably linked to one another. Because when you start to take seriously the biblical message of nonviolence, you start to apply that to all the other facets of your life, and you quickly come to the realization that it's very difficult to imagine that political involvement, secular politics, the nation state can be separated from violence. And so I was in college, actually, and I was introduced to it through guys like Jacques Ellul, Bernard Eller, Stanley Hauerwas. And now I think about it, and I'm working on a book as kind of an introduction to it for those who aren't familiar with it.
My story is real similar. I read those same authors when I was in college, and I think at the time, Stanley Hauerwas is someone who I don't think describes himself as a Christian anarchist, but I was reading him at exactly the same time. I was reading Christian Anarchy by Bernard Eller, and I forget, a very similar title by Jacques Ellul. So, I mean, very, very similar. Can I read you? I have Eller's book here, Christian Anarchy, and one of the places where he defines it, and then maybe I can get your thoughts on if you like this as a definition. Because, I mean, anarchy is a big, scary word. We associate it with chaos, and so his Eller's opening chapter is called "The Very Idea." He has a very fun, not everyone loves it, writing style, but he uses he says anarchy is simply the state of being unimpressed with, disinterested in, skeptical of, nonchalant toward, and uninfluenced by the highfalutin claims of any and all archies. And then he defines archies as they're basically the principalities and powers, but any principle of governance claiming to be primal value for society. That's an archy. He's kind of being playful with the language, but how do you think about Christian anarchy?
Well, I can tell you first what I don't think of. What I don't think of are guys wearing black skull masks, throwing Molotov cocktails at government buildings, right? Or sometimes people use the word anarchy just in their normal conversation as meaning like something chaotic and inherently violent, when in fact it is the exact opposite of that. Literally, the word itself, meaning against, arc meaning power, means against power or without power.
Well, because it's not anti-archy, so there's a stronger against prefix, and
Yeah.
like without. It is
If you choose to, it can go sort of either way, I think. Ultimately, I want to say that it is against. Just because I'm taking it from what Paul said, where our struggle is not against flesh and blood,
okay.
but against the powers and the principalities and the little spirits.
Okay.
That it is a struggle. It is a struggle. But by anarchy, what I am referring to is a disavowal of violence, power, and coercion as a means of living human life. Is that possible to pull off perfectly? Absolutely not. But it is the struggle to attain that, both in yourself and in your communities. And for me, there are a lot of secular anarchists, which is where the word is typically found, meaning sort of people who use that term from the secular left tend to think of themselves as the true Marxists, right?
Right.
That goes all the way into like Marx's understanding of communism and the stateless society. Christians mean something slightly different than that. It is not a revolutionary word, and it does not necessarily have a specific endpoint in mind, but it is first and foremost a devout commitment to nonviolence and an inherent suspicion of all forms of power and coercion in our society, whether they come from the state or whether they come from corporations or institutions. And that disavowal, that suspicion, comes to us through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And this is where the number one biblical passage that any Christian anarchist is going to point to is going to be the Philippians 2 Christ hymn, right?
Christ empties himself.
Yeah, even though he was God, did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited, but instead emptied himself. And at the beginning of that hymn, Paul exhorts his readers to let the same mind be in you that was in Jesus Christ. That Jesus represents a radically new way of being in the world, where it's not about enforcing, it's not about controlling, it's not about coercing, but it is living in such a way that even your own powerlessness testifies to the glory of God.
You mentioned Christian anarchism not being revolutionary. I mean, in some ways, some of the literature on this I'm familiar with goes out of its way to say explicitly that. And one of the flaws with revolution is that when the revolutionaries are successful, they set up shop, and they now they're anarchy too. And should. But surely some. I mean, let's talk about what some people might say in response to that, which is, well, but the situation for people, especially vulnerable people, might be better off after the revolution. Do you see Christian anarchism as an effort to simply think the same thing, like be equally disinterested in all archies, to use that language, equally? Or is there a way of, pointing out the positive role, if there is a positive role of some in contrast to others? Is there more of a positive role?
Absolutely. That's actually a really interesting and a really deep question in the anarchist world, which is how far do you take this commitment against power? Because let's be honest, sometimes power does seem to be used for good, right? If someone's in power and they use that power to help those who are being oppressed, if they use that power to give freedom, if they use that power to give medical care, that's a good use of power. And you can turn around and say, so are you against medical care? No.
Right.
It does mean that I do acknowledge that all of those instances are still tainted. They are good, but they are tainted. This is a conversation of means and ends, right? That the revolution, if you launch a revolution in like a country and you use it to give freedom to a bunch of people, well, number one, you've also just killed a bunch of people. You've made life very much worse for some people. And you justify that by saying, well, they were bad or they were evil. And Jesus has something to say about that too, right? But also you have to recognize that your ends, a just society, was not within the means.
Yeah.
And so as soon as you do it, yes, you have done good things for people, and that is undeniable. But already the infection has started to build, right? And I think you see this in places that have experienced revolutions for causes that were, we might say, very well justified. I mean, the treatment of the underclass in Russia and in the Slavic countries was awful. Serfdom under the czars was terrible. And the Bolsheviks did something to alleviate that.
Right.
And then made something much worse, right? You could say the same thing about Che Guevara, right? You could say the same thing about Cuba. You could say the same thing even with our own political institutions. And so the version of your question that gets thrown at me the most is, well, so what about voting then? Right? And as Americans, our lives are kind of dominated by voting as our one political act, right? Yeah. Like the vote, so much sanctity is conferred on your vote in public and over the media and people telling you to take it seriously. And so the first question is, should I vote? That is an open question in Christian anarchism.
I believe Ellul said no. And I've heard Michael Baxter of the Catholic Peace Fellowship say, don't vote, it just encourages them. I thought that was a good line.
He was actually quoting Dorothy Day.
Oh, okay. That was Dorothy Day.
The founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. And for those who aren't familiar, the Catholic Worker Movement is an absolutely fascinating study in a Christian anarchist organization that still exists today in every major urban center in North America. My view is confused. On one hand, absolutely not. There is a way of imagining that voting is violent. There is violence within it. For instance, if we were voting, say, on a referendum, right, which we don't really do very often here in the States, but let's say there was a referendum, and we were voting that everyone would pay $1, and that dollar would be given to save puppies. Okay, a very good cause that we all love and that we should all get around. Well, let's say there's one guy that doesn't want to pay his dollar. And he says, no, I hate puppies and I'm not going to do that. Well, what's going to happen? He's going to get a letter from the government. He's going to get a certified letter from the government. He's going to,
you were outvoted.
And then somewhere along the line, somebody comes to his house with a gun, right? He's in trouble, and he will be coerced one way or another to pay this dollar that the majority voted for. Democracy, as better as it is, and it is better. Let's be realistic about that. It's much better than, Vladimir Putin, what he's got going on, and some of these things. It is still about the majority having power over the minority, which means that every vote will be tainted. Personally, the last 3 elections, I have actually voted in. And I'm not sure if that was good or not. I actually called Stanley Hauerwas,
Did you really?
Our mutual acquaintance, and I said, Stanley, what should I do, man? And he said, well, vote this time. And that was in 2016. And he said, consider it an act of mercy for your Muslim brothers and sisters and your gay brothers and sisters and all of that. And when it comes to presidential elections, that's just been my mentality. I'm not sure if it's good. I'm not sure if it's orthodox. In fact, I know it's not, strictly speaking, orthodox in the Christian anarchist community. It is an act of violence. It's a small one. But at the same time, what I encourage people to think about, and especially my church members, is that a vote is only a vote. People say, well, if you don't vote, you don't get to complain, right? You've heard that. I think if all you did was vote, then you don't get to complain. What is a vote? It is something that takes 15 minutes on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, right? It does not require you to love anybody. It does not require you to sweat. It does not require you to work. It is the most shallow thing you can do to make your voice heard. And we laud it as the highest political good in this country. And I say that's hogwash. What I want to know is, what did you do the other 364 days? What did you do with the rest of your life to alleviate the suffering that you're voting to alleviate? How did you actually use your hands and your feet to do the work for justice and goodness in the world? We can get really self-righteous about voting, and living in a democracy, we put a lot of emphasis on our beliefs, right? On our opinions of things. Well, that's just the lowest form of knowledge, right? And if I had to judge everyone by their beliefs and opinions, and if I was judged by my beliefs and opinions, we would be living in a very shallow world. What I'm interested in as a Christian, as someone who cares about discipleship, is how are people living their lives? What are they doing to alleviate the suffering of those who are around them? Because, especially with our media world right now, all the emphasis on voting becomes such a distraction from that. And it allows us to think that because we voted for the right person, because we have the right opinions about things, we are somehow part of the solution, that we are somehow good or holy because we have the right idea about the way the world works and how it ought to run. Meanwhile, we can just sit at home and scroll on our phones and watch our chosen news channel all day. and tell us how great we are.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about, we talked a lot about governments, which are archies, principalities. Whatever the language is. But all institutions are. Can we talk about, what are your thoughts on the vast array of these kinds of things? Surely they're the obvious ones. And how do we identify maybe the less obvious ones? How do we know we're up against something?
I think you're running into archy territory whenever you are looking at hierarchies, right? And it's even in that word. Whenever you have someone who is in charge, who needs to be followed simply by the fact that they are in charge, and if they are not followed, there are consequences, right? So, for instance, in the United Methodist Church, we have a hierarchy that I'm a part of, right? I'm a clergy person. I'm above some people. I'm below others. And that is, I'm not sure that that's what Jesus had in mind, but it's the best way we've been able to figure out how to do it at this point. And we're always working to make sure that that power is not exploited. But we ought never think that God ordains it, that God somehow calls us to hold positions of power and authority over one another. But also, it's easy to see it in your workplace. It's easy to see it in corporations. It's easy to see it, unfortunately, in relationships. This is one of the reasons why in the Christian world, we have churches who practice something called complementarianism, which is the idea that men are the spiritual head of the household over the woman, right? And first of all, it assumes that all households are men and women. But second of all, it wants to say that God actually created the universe with this hierarchical imagination in mind. And I find that incredibly offensive and not at all consistent with the biblical witness of what God is trying to do in the world. So yeah, those archies, the biblical Greek language is the archons, are in all aspects of human life. And so being an anarchist isn't just about one's relationship to the state or lack thereof, but it is a commitment to live in such a way as to try not to use power, and when power is given to you, whether you want it or not, to work very hard not to exploit the power that you have over others.
Yeah. So, we get, I think, a common theme in this emphasis, this literature, this way of thinking, is finding some kind of alternative form of community. And I'm thinking about how Gandhi was influenced by Tolstoy in this regard, and he created Tolstoy Farm in South Africa. And we've talked about Hauerwas and his big book, which actually is a small book, Resident Aliens, and it has
with Will Willimon.
And it has a reference to Christians. About communities. He says Christian colony, which is not my favorite language to refer to a Christian community, but there are various attempts to live an alternative form of community, whatever that looks like. Do you see that as a necessary ingredient, or is there a kind of mainstream equivalent of that?
I think for me it starts in my household, right? It starts with my wife and I trying to live in such a way that we are not manipulating one another, that we are being as honest as we know how to be with one another, which is sometimes difficult. Like, we don't realize just how hard true honesty is and how we're all trained not to be honest. And then it expands out from there. In my church, I try to make my church a kind of alternative community to the rest of the world, where when people set foot in my church, I hope they notice something is palpably different about the way we treat one another and about how we live our lives and our commitment not to coerce or manipulate one another. But at the same time, it's imperfect. It's radically imperfect. There are a lot of Christians who are building intentional communities around these principles. Some have been happening for a very long time, right? There's a sense in which the Amish are a witness of a kind of Christian anarchism, although they would probably never use that language. That wouldn't even make sense to them. But they are people who work really hard to live their life without violence. And until 2004, they were pretty united against voting. But George Bush had a whole strategy around homosexuality to get them to vote and so on and so forth. But you have the Bruderhof. You have the communities that guys like Shane Claiborne are a part of, if people know him or are interested in him. And you have new monastic movements. I actually count my own Order of St. Luke as a part of that, where a religious order in dispersion. But we work really hard to be not to be conscious of our power, and that we are not using it to hurt one another.
I was thinking about coercion. Something that you mentioned, and I'm thinking about versions of nonviolence where nonviolent tactics can be coercive. And I think that's true. And in fact, I was having a conversation with a Quaker woman who joined a demonstration in support of the people of Gaza, but as soon as she joined, she felt like even though it was nonviolent, she said it felt violent, like the people she was around. And she didn't expand on that, but I took that to mean the spirit of it somehow was, it seemed to her at least violent, maybe coercive. So, I mean, what do you have any thoughts on how even, let's say, a movement or an action of a group of people or a person might be technically nonviolent, maybe on paper or whatever, but it's got a coercive element to it, even an element of violence, someone might say.
Yeah, I have a story that aligns very much with that. In 2005, me and some of my friends drove down to Washington, D.C. for something called the Christian Peace Witness for Iraq. And it was when the Iraq War was really getting started, and it was put on by Sojourners Magazine. Is that still around?
Oh, yes, it is. Yeah.
Jim Wallace.
Jim Wallace.
And he's
was apparently
speaking
in Columbus this week.
Oh, okay. And I was relatively new to the whole Christian pacifism thing. I went to a Quaker school, and that's where a lot of that got sort of invested in me. And I just hated war, and I said, okay, I'm a Christian. I'm going to go down there, and I'm going to speak up about it. And we met in the National Cathedral and marched from there to the White House. And the whole time there was this tension in the air, and it was really palpable. And people had signs for all kinds of things, and people were shouting really terrible things as we marched. And I was just like, I hit up against that. And someone had a great big cross at the front of the procession that they were marching down Pennsylvania Avenue with. And at some point, someone pulled a cord, and 2 American flags fell from the cross member of that cross. And they started singing "God Bless America."
Oh, my goodness.
And I was just like, I have to get out of this. Like this just turned from a message of peace and nonviolence into a kind of, and we didn't use this word back then, into a kind of Christian nationalism, albeit a leftist sort of Christian nationalism, right? And that attempt to make what we were saying sound like it was not just about being a faithful Christian, but being a faithful American, was either incredibly misguided or completely manipulative. And I know some people aren't going to understand my reasoning with that. For now, let me say very clearly that there's almost nothing about America as an ideal that corresponds with the values of nonviolence as articulated in the New Testament. And so I have a rule that I have developed since then. And I have friends, both personally and like in the Christian pacifist and anarchist community, that hate this rule. I do not march. I do not march. Number one, it's marching, right? Who marches? Marching in and of itself is about displaying a kind of power. It's about, in some cases, it can be about intimidation.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
And that is not the witness of Christ. Have good things happened through marches? 100%. You want to talk about the civil rights movement in this country. They used marches very effectively. That was awesome. I'm glad they did that. I am unwilling to do that. Not because I'm unwilling to put myself out there, because I'm unwilling to face criticism, but because I'm unwilling to try to intimidate somebody else.
Yeah, I think the implication can be like, look at how many people we've got. We're nonviolent for now, but anything could happen. So that's a coercive, intimidating kind of.
There's an implicit, unstated threat sometimes in marches. Now, something that may be different than that is what we in the higher liturgical world refer to as a procession, right? A procession is a long line of people who take a walk behind a cross for the sake of blessing their community, right? And inviting others to follow in the way of the cross. That is different than a march.
Sure.
But it accomplishes some of those same things in a different way.
Okay. Yeah. Let's finish by talking about our hearts. One of my goals with this podcast is to get us thinking along the whole range of expressing peace and finding peace and all that, from our heart all the way up to the geopolitical, everything in between. And a lot of people point out we don't want to isolate our interests in nonviolence to one side of the spectrum. So are there Christian anarchist practices that cultivate the kind of peace that you see aligned with your interest in Christian anarchism?
Yeah, I loved the word that was in the Eller book, that he had the word nonchalance in there. A kind of holy cynicism toward all those who are in power. And that is very much for the sake of my own soul. I look out right now at what's happening in our political world. And it is very distressing for a reason. And I see my brothers and sisters on the left who are absolutely distraught and angry and anxious and posting things and getting into arguments with their neighbors and all of these things. And while, yes, on some level that is justified, it was also justified on January 19th, right? It was also justified in 2023. It was also justified when Barack Obama was president and was using robots to kill brown people in the Middle East, right? Sure. For me, cultivating that nonchalance toward systems of power today is such a key spiritual practice because it keeps me centered on what I can do, right? The dearly departed Rachel Held Evans had a thing she used to say all the time, which both me and my wife take very seriously. What is the next right thing? And that's what I need to focus on. Because if I think about politics the way the media wants me to think about it, in the way, scrolling videos want me to think about it, then I'm going to be focused on being scared, being angry, holding my neighbors in suspicion, holding resentment, all of those things. But peace begins in the heart. And I truly believe that. That if I am not a person of peace, if I can't sit down and pray, then I'm never, ever going to be able to work for peace in my world, right? And one of the best practices that I think sort of aligns with my identity as a Christian anarchist is praying the Psalms. So many Psalms express that deep suspicion of power. And yes, some of them are violent, and we use allegory and metaphor to try to rehabilitate the meaning of those Psalms. But they always kind of, because I'm tempted by it too. I'm tempted by the news. I am tempted to think in that dualistic way about our politics and our society. The Psalms often bring me back to my centeredness.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thich Nhat Hanh has this Zen saying that we often we're told, don't just sit there, do something, and he wants to say, don't just do something, sit there.
That is fantastic advice. That'll preach. That's really good.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a really interesting conversation about Christian anarchism, and I hope our listeners, are intrigued and find something interesting and helpful here.
Thank you, Craig, for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.